Imagine finding an old family trinket, something you've seen 100 times, only to discover it holds a secret so powerful it rewrites your future. Sarah Nwosu thought she knew everything about her grandmother's bronze locket. She was wrong. What began as a simple keepsake would become a doorway into a hidden past, revealing ancestors who lived double lives and left behind more than memories. The locket had always been there, resting against Mama Neka's chest during Sunday service, catching the light from the stained glass windows of St. Matthew's Anglican Church in Udi. Sarah had admired its simple elegance as a child, tracing its scratched surface with tiny fingers while her grandmother hummed hymns in Igbo. The old woman would sometimes catch Sarah staring and smile, her weathered hand covering the locket protectively. "One day, Ne," she would whisper, "when you're ready to understand what it means to carry something precious." But some secrets are patient. They wait decades, sometimes generations, for the right person to stumble upon the right moment. They hide in plain sight, disguised as ordinary things. A cooking pot that once hid documents, a wrapper that concealed messages, a walking stick with a hollow core, or, in this case, a bronze locket that had traveled through time, carrying its burden of truth across 70 years of silence. Sarah had always assumed the locket was simply beautiful jewelry from a time when families had little but made much of what they possessed. She never suspected it was actually a treasure chest designed by someone who understood that the most dangerous secrets are best hidden in the most obvious places. Tonight, that patience would end, and Sarah's understanding of her family and herself would change forever. Mama Neka had grown smaller in her final months, as if she were slowly returning to the earth that had sustained her for 87 years. Her hands, once steady enough to deliver babies during the Biafran War and strong enough to pound yam for Sunday dinners that fed half the neighborhood, now trembled as she reached for her cup of Ovaltine. But her eyes remained sharp, watching Sarah with an intensity that felt like she was memorizing every detail of her granddaughter's face, storing images for a journey only she could see coming. "Come closer, Ne," she would whisper during Sarah's weekend visits from Lagos, where she worked at Pulse Media, creating viral content for young Nigerians hungry for stories that reflected their reality. The old woman would touch the locket at her throat, her fingers moving across its surface like someone reading Braille, tracing patterns that seemed to follow some internal map only she could see. Some things cannot wait for tomorrow. Some things must be remembered while there are still ears to hear and hands to receive. But when Sarah asked what she meant, Mama Neka would drift off to sleep, leaving questions hanging in the air like incense from evening prayers. The night before she passed, Mama Neka had been unusually restless, sitting up in bed and reaching for things that weren't there, her conversations directed at people only she could see. She kept touching the locket, whispering names Sarah didn't recognize. Adaeze, the trust, the daughters must know, the river remembers what we forget. Chinwe dismissed it as the confusion that sometimes comes with age, the mind revisiting old stories when the present becomes too difficult to navigate. But Sarah felt something different in her grandmother's urgency. There was purpose in those whispered words, a message trying to break free from decades of careful silence. The next morning, Mama Neka was gone, taking her secrets with her, or so everyone believed. The mahogany chest smelled of time itself, camphor, old paper, and the faint sweetness of dried flowers that Mama Neka had pressed between Bible pages decades ago. 3 days after the funeral, with the compound still echoing with the absence of the woman who had been its heartbeat for over 50 years, Sarah and her mother, Chinwe, sat surrounded by the carefully preserved remnants of a long life. Wrappers folded with precision that spoke of hands that never wasted anything. Photographs sorted by decade and labeled in careful script. Jewelry wrapped in soft cloth as if each piece were a sleeping child requiring gentle handling. Your grandmother lived through independence, through the war, through everything this country has seen," Chinwe said, holding up a faded wrapper with intricate hand-woven patterns that no machine could replicate. The geometric designs told stories of their own, symbols that had meaning in traditions that predated written language, patterns that connected the wearer to ancestral wisdom through visual language that survived even when spoken words were lost. She saved every meaningful thing, but she never told us why they were meaningful. I used to think it was just the way old people are, holding on to everything because they remember when there was nothing. When Chinwe lifted the bronze locket from its resting place, nestled between rosary beads and a small silver cross that had belonged to her own mother, Sarah felt a strange pull toward it, not attraction exactly, but recognition, as if her hands already knew its weight and texture from dreams she couldn't quite remember. "Take it, my child," her mother said, placing the warm metal in Sarah's palm. "Mama wanted you to have it. She told me so many times, when I'm gone, give it to Sarah, she'll understand." The weight settled against Sarah's chest like a promise, or perhaps a responsibility she hadn't yet learned to recognize. That evening, NEPA took the light again, plunging the compound into the familiar embrace of darkness that defined rural Nigerian nights. The generator coughed to life outside, its rhythm joining the symphony of evening sounds, crickets performing their ancient chorus, distant high-life music from a neighbor's radio, the soft conversation of night traders walking the main road with their wares balanced on their heads like crowns of commerce. Sarah lay on the thin mattress in her childhood room, where posters of American pop stars still clung to walls painted long ago in optimistic yellow that had faded to the color of old honey. In the generator's amber glow filtering through curtains her mother had sewn by hand, she examined the locket more carefully than she ever had before, turning it in her palms like a puzzle that might reveal its secrets through careful attention. Its surface wasn't just scratched. The marks formed patterns, deliberate and precise, like a code disguised as wear. The bronze had acquired a patina that spoke of decades against human skin, of being touched, worried and cherished by hands that understood its true value beyond mere decoration. There was something almost alive about it. The way it seemed to pulse with warmth that had nothing to do with the humid night air or her own body heat. The old women's whispers echoed in her memory. Heirlooms carry the breath of the dead. Sarah had always laughed at such sayings, dismissed them as superstition from a generation that saw spirits in every shadow. But grief has a way of softening laughter into listening, of making skeptics wonder if perhaps the ancestors know things that education never teaches. As she drifted towards sleep, the locket rested against her heart, and for the first time in days, her dreams were filled not with loss, but with the faces of women she'd never met who seemed to be waiting for something only she could provide. Morning light revealed what darkness had concealed. As Sarah prepared for the return journey to Lagos, packing the few things she'd brought for the funeral visit, she noticed something she'd missed the night before. A tiny notch along the locket's edge, so small it could have been a manufacturing flaw or the result of decades of wear against clothing and skin. But when she pressed it with her fingernail, curious about its purpose and wondering if it might be decorative, she heard a soft click that made her heart skip and her breath catch in her throat. The locket wasn't just a locket, it was a container designed by someone who understood that the most precious things often need to be hidden from those who would misuse or destroy them. The mechanism was so cleverly concealed that even someone wearing it daily might never discover its true purpose unless they knew exactly where to press and how much pressure to apply. The two halves separated along a seam that had been invisible until now, revealing a hollow interior lined with faded silk that still retains traces of its original deep blue color, the shade of evening sky that Igbo tradition associates with wisdom and protection. Nestled inside, folded like a secret taught to behave through generations of careful handling, lay a slip of brown paper no larger than her thumb and a tiny piece of metal that looked like a key designed for a lock too small for earthly doors. The paper felt fragile, as if breathing on it too hard might turn it to dust and take its secrets with it into the wind. Sarah's hands trembled as she unfolded the paper with the careful reverence reserved for handling butterfly wings or newborn babies. Faded ink revealed symbols she didn't recognize, curves and lines that looked intentional but foreign, like a language from another time when speaking plainly could cost a life and writing could cost more. At the bottom, written in a shakier hand that suggested either age or urgency, were two words in English, Adaeze and a date from 1947. Who was Adaeze? Why had Mama Nneka hidden this message for so many years, and what door was this tiny key meant to open? The bus journey back to Lagos felt interminable. Every bump and pothole jarring Sarah from her thoughts and back to the mystery burning in her pocket like a coal that wouldn't cool. The usual distractions of travel, conversations with fellow passengers about politics and rising food prices, vendors hawking snacks and cold drinks through the windows, the scenery rolling past the dusty windows like a movie she'd seen too many times, couldn't hold her attention for more than moments at a time. She couldn't focus on her phone, couldn't make small talk with the woman beside her who wanted to discuss the rising price of rice and the government's latest promises about improving the economy, couldn't even lose herself in the Nollywood movie playing on the bus's small television screen. The name Adaeze played on repeat in her mind, along with the strange symbols that seemed to dance before her eyes whenever she closed them, mocking her inability to decode their meaning through sheer force of will and desperate curiosity. This wasn't random. It was inheritance with assignment, though she didn't yet understand what she'd been assigned to do or why her grandmother had chosen her specifically to receive this burden rather than her mother or one of her aunts who were older and presumably wiser. But perhaps that was exactly the point. Perhaps some responsibilities require fresh eyes and the kind of energy that comes with youth. The willingness to ask questions that older people might be too polite or too tired to pursue. Her uncle Ikenna lived in a cramped workshop behind the main market in Enugu, where the air hummed with the resurrection of broken electronics and the constant smell of solder mixed with the spices from nearby food stalls. Radio sets from the 1980s sat alongside modern DVD players, all awaiting his particular magic, the ability to see potential in broken things and the patience to coax them back to life. His hands, stained permanently with electrical work, could restore voices to dead transistors and make silent speakers sing again. If anyone could help decode an old mystery, it would be someone who specialized in bringing forgotten things back to life. "Uncle, I need your eyes," Sarah said the next morning, placing the paper on his workbench between a dismantled radio that had been struck by lightning and a collection of spare batteries organized by size and voltage. The workshop smelled of hot metal and possibility, where broken things came to be healed by someone who understood that most problems had solutions if you were patient enough to find them and skilled enough to implement them without causing more damage than you were trying to repair. Ikenna squinted at the symbols through wire-rimmed glasses held together with electrical tape, his weathered face creasing with concentration as he traced each mark with a finger that had learned to see through touch after decades of working with components too small for easy visibility. Around them, the workshop hummed with the quiet activity of resurrection,
Capacitors charging, circuit boards waiting for diagnosis, the soft buzz of equipment that lived in the space between broken and whole, much like the mystery Sarah had brought to him. "This looks like Nisibidi," he said slowly after examining the paper from multiple angles, setting down his magnifying glass and removing his glasses to clean them, a gesture Sarah recognized as his way of buying time to think through implications before speaking. "But I'm no expert in the old writing. These symbols, they are deliberate, coded, not the kind of thing you'd use for everyday messages or casual communication. This is the kind of writing people used when ordinary words were too dangerous to trust to paper or memory." He paused, looking at Sarah with new interest, as if seeing her for the first time as someone who might be connected to stories larger than family gossip or casual curiosity about genealogy. "Where did you find this, my child? And why do I have the feeling this isn't just about satisfying curiosity?" When Sarah explained about the locket and its hidden compartment, Ikena's expression grew more serious. "If you want real answers, you need to see Mama Ifeoma. She remembers what the rest of us have forgotten, or what some of us were never told in the first place. But Sarah, some doors once opened don't close again. Are you sure you're ready for whatever this might reveal?" Mama Ifeoma's compound sat at the edge of town, where the paved road surrendered to red earth and the modern world quietly acknowledged the authority of older ways. Her house, built in the traditional style with a wide veranda that invited conversation and thick walls that kept the interior cool even during the harshest harmattan, was surrounded by gardens where lemongrass and basil grew alongside vegetables that had fed her family for decades. This was a place where time moved differently, where the urgent pace of modern life slowed to accommodate the careful rhythm of wisdom accumulated over 9 decades of observing human nature. Sarah found her shelling groundnuts in the morning shade, her movements economical and precise despite her age, each motion the result of thousands of repetitions across a lifetime of feeding others and making sure that nothing edible was ever wasted. Children played in the compound's dust, their laughter mixing with the sound of mortars and pestles from neighboring kitchens where women prepared the day's meals with ingredients that connected them to soil, seasons, and traditions that had sustained their people for centuries before colonialism tried to convince them that their ways were primitive. When Mama Ifeoma saw the paper in Sarah's hands, something shifted in her expression. Not surprise exactly, but recognition, as if she'd been expecting this visit for longer than Sarah could imagine. Her eyes, clouded with age but still sharp with intelligence, focused on the symbols with an intensity that suggested personal familiarity rather than academic interest. "Message language," she said immediately, setting aside her work with the gravity of someone who recognized significance in what others might dismiss as old marks on older paper. "Old ways, from when speaking could cost a life and writing could cost more," she continued, her voice carrying the weight of personal experience, of secrets kept and stories preserved through decades when preservation required courage more than memory. Mama Ifeoma's fingers moved across the symbols with the confidence of someone reading familiar text, though she paused occasionally to consider nuances that might have been lost to time or deliberately obscured by whoever had written the message under circumstances that probably didn't allow for careful penmanship. "It says, keep, remember, river," she translated, her finger moving from symbol to symbol like a guide through dangerous territory that she had navigated before under very different circumstances. "And here, Mimiri Udene, the sacred river where the ancestors still speak to those who know how to listen, where the water carries messages from those who came before to those who will come after." She looked up at Sarah with eyes that seemed to see straight through time, past the present moment, to connections that spanned generations and linked the living to the dead through obligations that transcended individual lifetimes. The certainty in Mama Ifeoma's voice was absolute, as if she were stating facts rather than speaking in the metaphors that often characterized discussions of spiritual matters. The tree knows your name, child, even if you don't know why yet. But you cannot go alone. Some paths require witnesses, and some secrets need more than one person to carry them safely into the future. Take someone you trust completely, someone who can see truth even when it's uncomfortable, someone who won't be swayed by fear or greed or the kind of pressure that powerful people apply when their interests are threatened. Sarah felt the locket pulse against her chest, warm metal against warm skin, as if responding to the mention of its original owner and the purpose for which it had been created so many decades ago. The tiny key seemed to burn in her pocket, eager to fulfill whatever purpose it had been designed for, waiting with the patience that only inanimate objects can maintain. "When should I go?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Some journeys can't be delayed once they've been set in motion. Some appointments with destiny won't be rescheduled for convenience.
Sarah called Tola that evening, catching her friend in the middle of editing photos from a wedding shoot that had lasted 14 hours and produced enough material to fill 3 albums with memories that the couple would treasure for decades. Tola Adebayo was everything Sarah wasn't. Impulsive where Sarah was cautious, artistic where Sarah was analytical, ready to chase adventure while Sarah preferred carefully planned outcomes that minimized risk and maximized control. They'd met during their National Youth Service in Abuja, bonded over shared frustrations with posting assignments that seemed designed to waste their education, and maintained their friendship through the years despite choosing very different paths through Lagos's competitive professional landscape. "You're telling me you found a secret compartment in your grandmother's jewelry?" Tola's voice crackled through the phone connection, excitement evident even through the static that plagued mobile networks in the evening when everyone was trying to call family members scattered across the country. "And there's some kind of treasure map written in ancient symbols? Sarah, this is like something from a movie. Of course I'm coming with you. I've been photographing the same weddings and naming ceremonies for months. I need something with actual mystery, something that might matter beyond making people look beautiful for their Instagram posts." But when Sarah tried to explain the weight she felt, the sense that this discovery came with responsibilities she didn't fully understand, Tola's response was immediate and reassuring. "That's exactly why you need someone with you who can document everything professionally. If this really is family history that's been hidden for 70 years, you owe it to yourself and to Adeze to make sure it doesn't get lost again because you were too scared to pursue it properly. Plus," she added with characteristic directness, "if you're walking into something dangerous, you need backup. And someone who knows how to make sure there's evidence if things go wrong." They arranged to meet at the motor park in Enugu the following morning, both understanding that they were embarking on something that might change their friendship and their understanding of what it meant to be connected to Nigerian history in ways more personal than what they'd learnt in school. The Okada ride to Mariudene took them through countryside that seemed untouched by the frantic pace of urban Nigeria, where the constant noise of generators and traffic gave way to sounds that had defined this landscape for centuries. Wind through palm fronds, distant lowing of cattle, the rhythmic thud of mortars and pestles as women prepared afternoon meals. Red earth roads wound between cassava farms and palm groves, past compounds where goats grazed and children waved from beneath mango trees heavy with fruits that would soon feed families and be sold at roadside markets. Tola rode behind the motorcycle driver,
her camera equipment carefully secured in a waterproof bag that had survived photo shoots in some of Lagos's most challenging neighborhoods. While Sarah followed on a second bike, the Locket and its key feeling heavier with each kilometer that brought them closer to their destination. The riders navigated potholes with the expertise of men who had been traveling these roads since childhood, their knowledge of every curve and obstacle allowing them to maintain surprising speed despite the rough conditions. The river appeared suddenly, emerging from the forest like a bronze ribbon thrown across green velvet by someone with an artist's eye for dramatic effect. Marie Udene moved with the confidence of water that had been flowing since before humans learned to name things, its surface reflecting clouds and sky and the occasional flash of a kingfisher diving for breakfast in waters that had provided sustenance for countless generations. The sacred nature of the place was immediately apparent. There was a quality to the silence here, a depth that spoke of prayers offered and answered across countless generations, of secrets shared between humans and the natural world that had witnessed their struggles. The Iroko tree stood massive and patient at the river's bend, its canopy wide enough to shelter a small village, its trunk scarred with decades of carved initials, prayers and promises left by those who believed trees could hold human hope and transform it into answered prayers through some ancient alchemy that connected the living to forces larger than individual desire. The Iroko's bark told stories in scars, initials carved by young lovers who might now be grandparents telling their own grandchildren about promises made under branches that had witnessed their entire relationship from first meeting to golden anniversary. Prayers etched by desperate parents during the Civil War when hope was the only currency that maintained its value. Marks left by students before important exams, by women before childbirth, by men before traveling to foreign countries in search of opportunities that their homeland couldn't provide. Some of the carvings were fresh, made by young people who still believed that declaring their love or their dreams to a tree might somehow make them more likely to come true. Others had been weathered smooth by time and rain, their messages now part of the tree's living history, absorbed into the growing wood that had turned human hopes into cellulose and bark. The tree had become a repository of community memory, holding prayers and promises that were too personal for churches and too important for mere conversation. But among all these human marks, Sarah was looking for something different. Something that would recognize the metal in her hand and respond to the purpose for which it had been created. She walked slowly around the massive trunk, feeling like an archaeologist searching for a specific artifact in a museum where everything looked significant, where every mark might be the clue she was seeking or simply another distraction from her true purpose. Then she saw it. A small protrusion in the back about chest high, weathered but distinctly metallic, almost completely camouflaged by decades of tree growth that had gradually incorporated the foreign object into its own structure. The metal had been placed so carefully that it seemed natural, as if the tree had grown around it protectively, keeping Adesi's secret safe from casual discovery while ensuring it would be available when the right person arrived with the right key. When Sarah pressed the tiny key against it, the fit was perfect, designed with precision that spoke of careful planning and considerable foresight about what would be needed decades in the future. The mechanism was old but well maintained by time and the tree's protective embrace, turning with surprising smoothness for something that had waited decades for this moment of activation. A section of bark swung inward like a tiny door, revealing a hollow space just large enough for a human hand, lined with some kind of waxy substance that had protected its contents from humidity, insects, and the various other threats that could destroy paper and metal over the course of 70 years of patient waiting. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow survived the humidity and time, was a small tin box that felt substantial in Sarah's hands, heavier than its size suggested, as if it contained more than just physical objects. The box bore the same motif as the locket, intertwined symbols that seemed to pulse with meaning she couldn't yet grasp but somehow recognized, as if her DNA carried memories her conscious mind had never learnt but which responded to visual cues that connected her to ancestral knowledge. Tola's camera clicked softly, capturing the moment when past and present finally met after 7 decades of patient waiting, documenting the instant when family legend transformed into historical fact. "Whatever's in there," Tola whispered, her voice filled with the reverence appropriate for witnessing history. "It's been waiting for you specifically. Trees don't keep secrets for just anyone, and mechanisms this sophisticated don't survive by accident. Someone planned this moment, planned for you to be here, planned for you to be the one to open what they sealed." The weight of the tin box in Sarah's hands felt like holding concentrated time. Decades of hope and planning and sacrifice reduced to something small enough to hide in a tree but significant enough to change everything. As she carried it back towards the river's edge where they could examine its contents in better light, Sarah understood that she was no longer just someone who had inherited a piece of jewelry. She was now the keeper of whatever secrets Adeze had considered important enough to preserve through decades of uncertainty, political upheaval, and the constant threat that her carefully laid plans might be discovered by those who would destroy them rather than allow them to fulfill their purpose.
Back at Mama Ifeoma's compound, the 3 women gathered around a tin box like archaeologists examining a precious artifact that might crumble if handled incorrectly. The elder's hands shook slightly as she helped Sarah pry open the lid, her excitement evident despite her efforts to maintain the dignity appropriate for her age and position as the community's keeper of memory and tradition. The lid opened with a soft sigh, releasing the musty scent of old paper and preserved cloth, smells that spoke of careful preparation and long waiting by someone who had understood that important things require patient preservation. Inside lay documents that had been prepared for a long wait by someone who understood that preservation required more than just hiding. It required protection against humidity, insects, fire, and the various other threats that could destroy evidence over the course of decades. Papers wrapped in oiled cloth, tied with thread that had somehow retained its strength across the decades, formed neat bundles that suggested organization rather than hasty hiding. Each item had been placed with care, positioned to survive not just time, but the various emergencies that might threaten their existence. The centerpiece was a leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with careful handwriting in blue-black ink that had somehow resisted fading despite decades in tropical humidity. Column after column listed women's names, dates, and small monetary contributions, amounts that spoke of sacrifice, of coins saved from selling palm oil and pepper at the market, of women who understood that great things sometimes require many small contributions rather than single grand gestures that only the wealthy could afford. "For the trust of Adaizi's daughters," read the inscription at the bottom of each page, written in the same steady hand that had recorded every transaction with the precision of someone who knew that future generations would need proof of what had been sacrificed in their name. The amounts were small by modern standards, a few shillings here, a pound there, but they represented enormous sacrifices for women whose entire monthly income might have been less than what Sarah now spent on mobile phone credit in a single week.
A separate envelope contained a cloth fragment bearing the same interwoven motif as the locket, its colors still vibrant despite decades of storage, suggesting that it had been dyed with materials designed to resist fading, another sign of careful planning by someone who thought in terms of decades rather than years. Beneath that lay a second brass key, this one larger and stamped with a six-pointed star that seemed familiar, though Sarah couldn't place where she'd seen it before. Its weight and craftsmanship suggesting it opened something more substantial than the tree's hiding place. But it was the photograph that made Sarah's breath catch and her heart race with recognition that felt deeper than visual similarity. A group of women in traditional wrappers, their faces serious and determined, stood in front of what looked like a colonial-era building with district office carved into its stone facade. These weren't women posing for a casual family portrait. Their positioning was deliberate, their expressions suggesting they had gathered for purposes that required the kind of secrecy that survives in hidden compartments and coded messages. In the center of the photograph, wearing the familiar bronze locket that now hung around Sarah's neck, stood a woman whose eyes held the same fierce intelligence Sarah recognized in her own reflection. The same direct gaze that refused to look away from difficult truths. The same set to the jaw that suggested stubbornness in service of principle rather than mere obstinacy. This had to be Adaeze, captured in a moment when she'd stood with other women who had decided that change was worth whatever risks it required, when they had chosen to act rather than simply endure whatever others decided was appropriate for their lives. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in careful script that had somehow survived the decades without smearing or fading. Custody rests with the first daughter's line until the trust is redeemed. The land remembers what people forget. Adaeze, 1947. The words sent a chill down Sarah's spine, not from fear, but from recognition. She was the first daughter's line, the inheritor of a responsibility that had been waiting her entire life for her to discover it and prove worthy of its demands. Research became Sarah's obsession, consuming her lunch breaks, her evenings, and her weekends with the intensity of someone who had discovered that her family history was far more complex and significant than she'd ever imagined. Every free moment was spent in libraries, archives, and online databases, piecing together the story of Adaeze Nwosu, the ancestor whose name had never been mentioned in family conversations, whose contributions had been erased from official family history as thoroughly as if she had never existed. What she discovered painted a picture of a woman who had lived a carefully constructed double life during one of Nigeria's most turbulent periods, when the foundations of colonial rule were cracking under pressure from educated Africans who refused to accept subordination as natural or permanent. Officially, Adaeze was a respected midwife in colonial-era Enugu, known for her steady hands and her ability to coax reluctant babies into the world, earning the trust and gratitude of families across multiple communities regardless of their ethnic background or economic status. Birth records from the colonial archives showed she delivered over 300 children during her career, an impressive number that testified to her skill and the trust that families placed in her abilities. But the ledger told a different story, one of a woman who had used her position as a cover for something far more dangerous than bringing babies into the world. The dates in the ledger coincided with early independence movements, and the women's names matched those of non-organizers and supporters of anti-colonial activities that the British administration had been working desperately to identify and suppress. Adaeze hadn't just delivered babies, she delivered coded messages, using her rounds as a midwife to carry intelligence between safe houses and planning cells that were coordinating resistance activities across southeastern Nigeria. The locket hadn't just jewelry, it had been a courier's tool designed to hide messages too dangerous to trust to memory or conventional mail systems that were monitored by colonial authorities. Every birth she attended, every home she visited was an opportunity to weave together the underground network that would eventually help birth a nation. Armed with historical context and documentation that was becoming more compelling by the day, Sarah and Kemi began building a legal case that would challenge Chief Okori's ownership of the land near Mriudeni. The process required navigating Nigeria's complex property laws, which layered post-independence legislation over colonial regulations that had been designed to serve very different purposes and which often contradicted each other in ways that favored those with the resources to exploit legal ambiguities. The original colonial records, preserved on brittle paper that required careful handling, showed that Adaeze's Women's Cooperative had secured a 99-year lease for land near the Sacred River, with specific provisions for agricultural use and the establishment of educational facilities. The language was precise, suggesting that Adaeze had worked with someone who understood colonial law well enough to create agreements that would survive governmental changes and legal challenges that might arise decades in the future. But tracing ownership from the 1940s to the present revealed a pattern that was becoming depressingly familiar. Property that had been legally held by African families or organizations somehow finding its way into the portfolios of wealthy businessmen through transactions that look legitimate on paper but which fell apart under careful scrutiny. Documents had been backdated, witnesses had signed papers after their recorded deaths, and approval stamps had been applied by officials who had never worked in the relevant departments during the alleged dates of transfer. By the 1980s, the land had somehow ended up in Chief Okori's hands through a series of transactions that followed this same pattern. Impressive documentation that concealed fundamental irregularities, legal proceedings that had been conducted without notifying affected parties, and approvals that had been granted through processes that had never been properly explained. His current plans, according to recent filings, include expanding his poultry operation and developing a residential estate that would transform the Sacred River area into another wealthy enclave for Lagos professionals seeking weekend escapes from urban stress.
Word travels fast in Nigerian business circles, especially when lawyers start asking questions about property deals that powerful people prefer to keep quiet, and when those questions involve documentation that might expose the questionable foundations of significant wealth. 2 days after Kemi filed preliminary inquiries with the land registry, Sarah received a phone call at work from a smooth voice that introduced itself as representing Chief Okori's interests without providing a name or title that could be verified later if circumstances required accountability. The conversation was polite, almost friendly, conducted in the kind of English that suggested expensive education and careful cultivation of influential contacts who could make problems disappear through phone calls rather than legal proceedings. The chief has great respect for family history, the voice explained, its tone suggesting someone who had conducted many similar conversations and who understood exactly how much pressure to apply without crossing lines that might create legal complications. But he's also a reasonable man who believes in win-win solutions that serve everyone's interests without unnecessary conflict. Perhaps we could arrange a meeting to discuss this matter privately, find a way to honor your grandmother's memory without unnecessary complications that might prove expensive and time-consuming for everyone involved. The pause before complications carried weight, suggesting consequences that didn't need to be spelled out explicitly to someone intelligent enough to understand how power operates in Nigeria. When Sarah insisted that any discussions should include her lawyer, the voice grew cooler, though it maintained its professional veneer like a mask that had been carefully fitted and practiced.
Of course, though we hope this can be resolved among reasonable people without involving courts and publicity that might be uncomfortable for everyone involved. The implication was clear. Chief Okori had resources to make problems disappear, while Sarah had only the truth and whatever protection the law might provide to someone willing to challenge established power. That evening, Sarah found a manila envelope slipped under her apartment door. Inside was a property survey showing Chief Okori's planned development, along with a newspaper clipping about frivolous land claims that had bankrupted the claimants. There was no note, no threat, just information presented without comment, but the message was unmistakable. The breakthrough came from the second brass key and a discovery that changed everything. While researching colonial-era banking institutions, Kemi learned that the star symbol matched the logo of the West African Commercial Bank, which had operated in Nigeria during the 1940s before merging with First Bank. Armed with Adaize's documentation and the key, they visited the bank's heritage department, where legacy accounts waited like sleeping giants for their rightful heirs. The elderly bank officer, Mr. Emeka Okafor, recognized the key immediately and led them to a vault that felt like a museum of forgotten fortunes. The key turned smoothly, and the metal drawer revealed Adaize's final surprise, a strip of microfilm and a bank book showing regular deposits from 1947 to 1962. The account had continued growing through compound interest for decades, its existence known only to a handful of bank employees who treated it as an institutional curiosity. The microfilm contained photographs of documents that proved everything: trust amendments, scholarship provisions, and detailed plans for a midwifery training center that had been waiting 70 years for implementation. More importantly, it contained correspondence between Adaize and colonial officials that had never appeared in public records, showing negotiations that established the land trust's legal foundation. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and perfectly preserved. But as they left the bank, Sarah noticed a black Mercedes following them through Lagos traffic. The intimidation was escalating, and she realized that Chief Okori was prepared to do more than just file legal papers to protect his interests. She touched the locket at her throat and whispered, "We are the bones, and bones don't scare easily." The courtroom in Lagos High Court buzzed with tension as the case that had captured public attention finally reached its conclusion. Justice Folake Adeyemi had listened to weeks of testimony with the patience of someone who understood that some cases were about more than property. They were about whether ordinary people could challenge powerful interests when truth was on their side, whether historical injustices could be corrected through legal means, and whether the sacrifices of previous generations would be honored or erased. Chief Okori's legal team had fought hard, challenging every document, questioning every witness, and arguing that colonial agreements had no validity in modern Nigeria. But they had made a critical error by attacking Sarah's credibility, which gave Kemi the right to subpoena records that revealed the questionable nature of Chief Okori's own property acquisitions. The pattern of backdated documents, deceased witnesses, and irregular approvals that had characterized his business practices for decades was finally exposed to judicial scrutiny. The judgment was clear and uncompromising. The trust was valid, the locket and documents were credible custodial tools, and the subsequent leases that had transferred the land to Chief Okori were tainted by procedural irregularities and questionable documentation. The land would return to the Women's Association, and the accumulated bank funds would be released to establish the Adaize Center for Midwives and Girls Scholarships, exactly as the great-grandmother had envisioned 70 years earlier. But victory was a door rather than a destination. Within months, Adaeze's plans began taking physical form, a modern clinic where traditional midwifery could be taught alongside contemporary medical practices, a training hall where young women could learn skills that would make them self-sufficient, and demonstration plots where widows could learn sustainable farming. On opening day, Sarah spoke briefly. This heirloom was not decoration, it was direction. It changed my life by reminding me that my life was never only mine. As the ribbon fell and the first expectant mother entered the clinic, the locket grew warm against her skin, heat without flame, approval without words. A proverb settled over the celebration. Onwo anagi egbochi aha oma. Death does not kill a good name.